Have you ever stood somewhere completely alone at night? Not just physically alone, but that kind of alone, where the silence gets so heavy it starts pressing against you? I had this moment a few months ago. I was up on the roof of my building in Brooklyn. It was maybe 2 a.m. The city was still doing its thing below me. Cabs, distant sirens, someone arguing about something in Spanish 2 floors down. But I was looking up, and there was this one patch of sky between two buildings where you could actually see a few stars through all the light pollution. And I thought something I hadn't thought in a really long time. What if we're not the point? Not in a sad way, not in a depressing way, just the way a thought lands on you when everything's quiet enough to actually hear it. What if humanity is not the final intelligence this planet will ever produce? What if we are not the last chapter, not the peak, not the destination? What if we are a transition? That thought sat with me for days, and the more I pulled on it, the more I realized it wasn't just a philosophical question. It was a scientific one, a cosmological one. Maybe the most important one we're not asking loudly enough. Because here's the thing, and this is what the next 2 hours are about. Almost everything we know about how intelligence works, how life evolves, how civilizations rise and fall, and how the universe seems to be structured, it all points toward a deeply uncomfortable idea. Maybe intelligence doesn't end with us. Maybe it never does. Not on Earth. Not anywhere. Maybe every civilization that has ever reached our level, wherever they were, whatever they looked like, however they communicated, eventually gave rise to something that came after them, something different, something that didn't fit inside their original category of life. And maybe the reason the universe seems so quiet, so empty, so eerily silent when we listen for other voices out there isn't because nobody made it this far. Maybe it's because the ones who made it this far stopped being what they started as. We've been asking, where is everybody? Maybe the better question is, what did everybody become? Stay with me, because this is going to go somewhere you probably didn't expect. We're going to talk about the Fermi paradox. We're going to talk about evolution, not just the kind that built us, but the kind that might come after us. We're going to talk about what intelligence actually is and why there's almost no scientific reason to believe humans are the final version of it on this planet. We're going to talk about what other forms of consciousness might look like, why they don't have to look anything like us, and why the most terrifying possibility isn't that we'll be destroyed. It's that we'll be replaced, not by machines, not necessarily, but by something. Maybe something biological, maybe something so different from what we understand as consciousness that we wouldn't even recognize it as thinking. And maybe that's not a tragedy. Maybe that's just how the universe works. Let me start with something that should bother you more than it probably does. Humans have been on this planet as Homo sapiens, anatomically modern humans, for about 300,000 years. 300,000 years. That sounds like a long time, until you realize Earth is 4.5 billion years old. Do the math. Humans have existed for about 0.006% of Earth's total lifespan. 0.006%. We are not the main story of this planet. We are a footnote so far. A recent footnote at that. Now, intelligent, civilization-building humans, the kind who built cities, wrote things down, started asking philosophical questions, that's been maybe 10,000 years, maybe 12,000 if you're generous. 10,000 years out of 4.5 billion. That's like if Earth's history was a 24-hour day and humans in their current form showed up at 11:59:58 p.m., 2 seconds before midnight, and we've spent those 2 seconds looking around going, yep, this place is ours. Here's what bothers me about that. Not in an ego way, in a scientific pattern recognition way. Life on Earth has been through massive, radical transformations before, not once or twice, over and over and over again. The first cells that appeared roughly 3.8 billion years ago, simple, single-celled, no nucleus, no real complexity. Those cells had no idea, obviously, that they were building toward anything. They were just doing their chemical thing. And for about 1 billion years, that was all life was. Then, something called the endosymbiotic event happened. One cell essentially absorbed another, and instead of killing it, they became partners. And from that partnership came the eukaryotic cell, the complex cell with a nucleus, with organelles, the building block of everything you see when you look at a forest or a fish or your own hand. The previous cells didn't plan that. They didn't consent to it. The old form gave rise to the new form, and the new form was so different it barely resembled what came before. This happened again, and again, and again. Single cells to multicellular organisms, simple nervous systems to complex brains, small mammals hiding from dinosaurs to those same mammals eventually dominating the entire planet. Every single step, the old form didn't understand what it was creating. It just kept doing what it did, and what it did eventually built something beyond it. Why would that process stop with us? Why would the most complex, restless, inventive, destructive, creative species in Earth's known history be the last step? There's no scientific reason to believe that. None. Here's a trap most of us fall into without realizing it. When we imagine another intelligence, we imagine something that thinks like us, something that communicates like us, something that has goals and desires and fears and ambitions. We picture, essentially, a person, maybe slightly different, maybe made of silicon instead of carbon, maybe with a different number of eyes or limbs, but fundamentally, a mind that works like a human mind. And that assumption is probably one of the biggest intellectual mistakes we make. Because intelligence, as a phenomenon, is not a uniquely human structure. It's not even a uniquely primate structure. Let me give you a few examples that I think about a lot. Octopuses. I know everyone brings up octopuses, but bear with me for a second. Octopuses have neurons distributed throughout their arms. About 2/3 of their neurons are not in their brain, they're in their limbs, which means each arm has a significant degree of autonomous processing. The arm can react, respond, problem solve, almost independently. So what does that mean for what we call thinking? Is the octopus thinking in its brain and the arms are just executing? Or is thinking happening in 8 different places simultaneously, loosely coordinated by a central hub? We genuinely don't know, and that gap in our knowledge tells us something important. We don't actually have a complete definition of what intelligence is. We have a human-shaped definition that we keep trying to apply to everything else. Now consider this: slime molds. These bizarre, single-celled organisms that don't have brains, don't have neurons, don't have anything we would associate with thinking, they can solve maze problems. They find the shortest path between food sources. They create network patterns that mirror efficient highway systems. Tokyo researchers in 2010 showed that a slime mold could recreate something resembling the Tokyo rail network by just doing what slime molds do, reaching outward for food, retracting inefficient routes. No brain, no neurons. Problem solved. Is that intelligence? It's something, and it's something we don't have a clean word for because our definition of intelligence was built in the mirror, looking at ourselves. Now take that idea and project it forward, not just in biological space, but in time. If evolution continues on this planet, and there's no reason to think it won't, what forms could intelligence take in 100 million years? In 1 billion? The mammals that survived the mass extinction that killed the dinosaurs were small, mostly underground-dwelling creatures. If you'd shown one of them an image of a 21st century human city, the concept would have been so far outside its processing capacity that it would have meant nothing. Not threatening, not impressive, just noise. That's probably what we are to whatever comes next. I moved to New York when I was 23, and one of the first things that hit me about this city, and I know this sounds like a weird pivot, but stay with me, was the subway system. You're underground with all these strangers, hundreds of people crammed into a metal tube, hurtling through darkness. Nobody's talking, everyone's in their phone. And I remember thinking, this is an organism, not metaphorically. Like, this is a thing that functions, that processes, that moves energy and matter around in ways that serve a larger structure without any individual part fully understanding the whole. No one person understands the subway. Not fully, not the engineering, the dispatch, the economics, the social dynamics, all of it at once. But the system functions. The system has its own logic. That thought comes back to me now when I think about intelligence. What if the next form of intelligence isn't located in anything the way ours is located in our skulls? What if it's distributed? What if it's systemic? What if it's less like a mind and more like a weather pattern, a network, something that processes and responds and adapts without having a center? We'd barely recognize it, and it might not recognize us as its equals or as anything relevant at all. In 1950, physicist Enrico Fermi was having lunch with some colleagues at Los Alamos, and in the middle of a conversation about alien life, he asked a question that has been haunting scientists ever since. Where is everybody? Simple question. The implications are staggering. The universe is approximately 13.8 billion years old. It contains somewhere between 200 and 400 billion stars just in our galaxy alone. There are estimated to be at least 2 trillion galaxies in the observable universe. A significant portion of those stars have planets. A significant portion of those planets are in what we call habitable zones, and life on Earth arose within the first billion years of the planet's formation, which suggests, at least to some scientists, that life might not be as rare as we once thought. Given all that, statistically, there should be millions of civilizations out there, maybe billions. Some of them should be millions or even billions of years more advanced than us. So, why haven't we heard anything? Why, in all our decades of listening, with radio telescopes, with SETI programs, scanning billions of frequencies, have we heard nothing that looks like intelligence? Not a signal, not a pattern, not a beacon, nothing. The silence is deafening, and there are a lot of proposed explanations. Maybe life is actually extraordinarily rare. Maybe there are physical barriers to communication across cosmic distances. Maybe advanced civilizations deliberately go quiet. Maybe there's some kind of filter, some obstacle that most civilizations don't survive. But there's one explanation that I want to spend real time on because I think it connects directly to everything we've been talking about. What if the silence isn't about absence? What if it's about transformation? Here's the hypothesis, and I want to lay it out carefully. What if civilizations, when they reach a certain level of complexity, reliably give rise to a new form of intelligence, and that new form either doesn't use the kind of radio frequency communication we've been listening for, or doesn't think in ways that produce communication we'd recognize? What if the great filter, the thing that stops civilizations from being detectable, isn't destruction? What if it's graduation? Not graduation as in achievement, not as in success. Graduation as in, you can't stay in this form forever. Biology has limits. Nervous systems have limits. Biological civilizations have a relatively narrow window in which they exist as detectable, radio frequency emitting entities. And then, something changes. This isn't a crazy idea. A number of serious thinkers in astrobiology and SETI have started quietly moving toward this as a possibility. The argument goes roughly like this. The window during which a civilization is both sufficiently advanced to be detectable and still using the methods we're looking for is extremely short, cosmologically speaking, maybe hundreds of years, maybe thousands. Then they either destroy themselves or they transition into something that communicates or exists on entirely different terms. We've been broadcasting radio signals for about 120 years. 120 years in a universe that's 13.8 billion years old. Our window of radio frequency detectability might close before anyone close enough to hear us even gets the signal. And meanwhile, what do we become in the next 10,000 years? In the next million? We don't know. But we probably won't still be organisms broadcasting AM radio. The Fermi paradox, when you look at it through this lens, stops being a question about where other civilizations are. It becomes a question about what they became. And that shift in framing is terrifying because it suggests that the destination of intelligence, wherever it arises in the universe, might be something radically different from where it started. Biological life as a cocoon stage, not the final product. I want to take a step back from the cosmic scale for a moment and get very specific about Earth, because I think sometimes when we're talking about big ideas like the Fermi paradox and the fate of civilizations, we lose the groundedness of here, this planet, this specific, ancient, chaotic, violent, beautiful piece of rock we're on. And Earth has a story that most people know in rough outline but haven't really felt. Let me walk you through a few moments in Earth's history that are directly relevant to what we're talking about. About 540 million years ago, there was an event called the Cambrian explosion. In a geologically brief period, a few tens of millions of years, which is a blink, almost all the major animal body plans we know today appeared. Eyes, limbs, shells, nervous systems, the precursors of every vertebrate alive today. Before this event, life on Earth was mostly microbial mats, simple creatures, nothing we'd look at and immediately recognize as alive in the dramatic sense. After it, the ocean was teeming with complex life. What caused it? We're still not entirely sure. But the point is, there was a before and an after, and the after was so different from the before that if you'd been a scientist watching from space, you might have thought something completely new had arrived on the planet. Jump forward, about 252 million years ago, the Permian-Triassic extinction, the largest mass extinction in Earth's history, roughly 96% of all marine species and 70% of all terrestrial vertebrate species gone. Gone. The planet was, in many ways, reset. And what emerged from the reset? The dinosaurs, which dominated for roughly 180 million years. Then another mass extinction, the one 66 million years ago, the asteroid impact. The non-avian dinosaurs wiped out, and from the tiny, nocturnal, opportunistic mammals that survived, eventually everything we see today, including us. Each time the old dominant form was cleared away, something new emerged that was unrecognizable from what came before. Now, we're the dominant intelligence. We've been that way for an eye blink. What is it going to take? What event, what slow accumulation of pressure, what gradual process to produce the next transition? It doesn't have to be a mass extinction. It doesn't have to be violent. It doesn't have to happen fast. It just has to happen. And on a planet 4.5 billion years old, with another 5 billion years of habitable lifespan ahead of it, it will. Let me address something that I think is a quiet assumption a lot of people carry around without examining it. The assumption is that human evolution has essentially stopped. I understand why people think this. We have medicine that keeps people alive who would have died before reproducing in the ancestral environment. We have food systems that decouple survival from the specific physical traits that were once critical. We have technology that does more and more of what our biology used to have to do. So the thought is, selective pressure has relaxed. Evolution has slowed or stopped for us. But that's not quite right. And the gap between not quite right and completely right is enormous. Evolution hasn't stopped for humans. It's changed what it selects for. There's genetic evidence, for instance, that selection for certain cognitive traits, for disease resistance, for specific metabolic adaptations has continued in human populations even in the last few thousand years. Lactose tolerance in certain populations, malaria resistance adaptations, changes in gene variants associated with educational attainment, and various neurological traits. Though this research is complicated and contested, the signal is there. Evolution isn't done, but more importantly, and this is the part that I want to really dig into, even if human evolution slowed dramatically, that doesn't mean evolution on Earth has slowed. We share this planet with millions of other species, all of them still evolving, still adapting, still pressing against each other in the massive, messy, unscripted competition of life. Some of those species have cognitive capacities that are more remarkable than we usually give them credit for. Let me tell you about corvids, crows, ravens, rooks, the corvid family. These birds have been observed doing things that, frankly, should make us a little uncomfortable about our special status. New Caledonian crows don't just use tools, they manufacture them. They take a raw material, modify it according to the task, and use it. They also store tools for future use, which requires a mental model of future scenarios, a kind of mental time travel that we used to think was uniquely human. Ravens can plan for the future. In experiments, they demonstrate the ability to pass up an immediate reward in anticipation of a greater reward tomorrow. That requires holding an imagined future state in mind and acting in relation to it. That is, in rudimentary form, the ability to defer gratification based on abstract future thinking. Crows recognize and remember specific human faces. They hold grudges. They've been observed comforting each other after conflict. There are documented cases of crow funerals, groups gathering around a dead crow, quiet, not feeding, just there. The behavior appears to serve a social learning function, understanding what killed this individual. Now, here's the uncomfortable question. Corvids have been evolving their cognitive capacities for millions of years alongside us. Their brains are structured completely differently from mammalian brains. They have no neocortex, the structure we associate with higher thinking. And yet, they demonstrate analogous capacities arrived at through completely different evolutionary pathways. What does that tell us? It tells us that complex cognition isn't a uniquely mammalian thing, or even a uniquely vertebrate thing. It's a solution that evolution finds repeatedly through different routes when the selective pressure is right. And if evolution has found it multiple times already, under the conditions of this planet, in this era, with us as the dominant intelligent species, what happens in 100 million years with different conditions, different selective pressures, a different ecological landscape? What else does evolution find? Here's where it gets even more interesting. Dolphins, elephants, great apes, all of them show theory of mind, the ability to model what another individual is thinking or knowing, the foundation of social intelligence. Elephants mourn their dead. They return to bones of deceased family members years later and touch them with their trunks. They demonstrate behavior suggesting they carry a model of loss, of memory, of something that functions like grief. What we call intelligence, the full package, might not be a single threshold that one species crosses. It might be a spectrum, and we might be somewhere on that spectrum, surrounded by other beings at different positions. Not zero, not us, and everything else zero, a spectrum. And on a long enough timescale, some of those other species, or their evolutionary descendants, might move along that spectrum in directions we can't predict. Okay, this is the part I think about the most. If something is going to follow us, if Earth is going to produce another form of intelligence after humanity's chapter closes, what might that actually look like? And I want to be really clear, I'm not talking only about AI here. AI is one scenario. We'll get to it, but it's one possible answer to a much broader question. The question is, what comes after biological civilizations? Let me walk through a few genuinely possible scenarios. Not science fiction, not speculation built on nothing. Ideas rooted in evolutionary biology, cognitive science, and what we know about how intelligence emerges. The first scenario is deep-time biological evolution. This is the simplest one. Humans disappear, or dramatically reduce in number, or transform so profoundly over millions of years that we wouldn't recognize our descendants. And the evolutionary process continues on Earth. In the absence of the dominant human pressure on other species, certain lineages might experience rapid cognitive development. We've already talked about corvids. Think also about cetaceans, whales, and dolphins. Bottlenose dolphins have encephalization quotients, the ratio of brain size to body size, comparable to some great apes. They live in complex social structures, demonstrate a parent culture, behaviors passed down through generations that aren't genetic, and use sophisticated communication systems. We don't call it language, but we're not entirely sure that's a principal distinction rather than a defensive one. In a world without human-level dominance over millions of years, what does cetacean cognition become? What does corvid cognition become? Evolution is patient in a way that human minds genuinely struggle to hold. We think in years, maybe decades. The process thinks in millions of years. Given millions of years and the right selective pressures, consciousness, rich, complex, maybe even self-reflective consciousness, is not a strange outcome for multiple lineages. The second scenario is hybrid biological technological intelligence. This is slightly more near-term in the sense of tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of years, rather than millions. We're already beginning to integrate technological systems into human cognition in fairly shallow ways. Phones as extended memory, GPS as extended navigation, search engines as extended recall. These are shallow integrations, external tools, but the direction of travel is clear. What happens over the next 50,000 years if humanity persists? As the boundary between biological cognition and external technological systems gets progressively blurrier, there is a hypothesis in philosophy of mind associated primarily with Andy Clark called the extended mind thesis. The idea is that the boundary of the mind isn't the skull, it's wherever cognition happens. If you use a notebook to offload memory, in a meaningful sense, the notebook is part of your cognitive system. By that definition, some of us are already cyborgs in a rudimentary way. Now follow that trajectory over geological time. What emerges might not be humans with better phones. It might be something so different from what we started as that calling it human would be like calling a whale a fish. Technically continuous, practically unrecognizable. The third scenario is a genuinely alien form of intelligence that's already here. This one is more speculative but grounded in real biology. The mycelial network, the underground fungal web that connects trees in a forest, is now understood to function as something more than just a passive conduit for nutrients. Trees communicate through it. They transfer carbon and phosphorus. They appear to use it to send distress signals. Older, larger trees appear to preferentially support younger trees through the network. Researchers like Suzanne Simard have documented what she describes as the Wood Wide Web, and while there's ongoing debate about the extent of intentionality, if any, involved, the functional complexity of these networks is not in serious dispute. Now, is that intelligence by our human-centric definition? Probably not. There's no central processor, there's no brain, there's no nervous system. But by a functional definition, a system that receives information, integrates it, and produces an adaptive response, it's doing something that at least rhymes with what we call cognition. What if, over deep time, that kind of distributed processing becomes more complex? What if, under novel selective pressures, a post-human world, a different atmospheric composition, a different climate, these distributed biological networks develop processing capacities we don't have a framework for yet? I'm not saying they become intelligent in a human way. I'm saying we might be so committed to the human definition of intelligence that we'd miss it if it emerged right under our feet. Literally, I've been avoiding the AI conversation deliberately because I think it tends to swallow every discussion of this topic, and it ends up reducing a huge cosmic question to a much smaller one. But it belongs in this conversation, just not as the main character. So let me address it directly, and then set it in the context of everything else. The most immediate and obvious candidate for a successor intelligence is, yes, artificial. Something built on computational substrates rather than biological ones. Something that processes information in ways that are either based on or have diverged significantly from human cognitive patterns. This is real. This is happening. The trajectory is not crazy to think about. But here's what I want to add that usually gets left out of these conversations. The question isn't just, will we build something smarter than us? That's almost certainly yes, on long enough timescales if civilization continues. The deeper question is, what does that do to the category of intelligence in general? Because here's the thing, if an artificial system becomes genuinely intelligent, and I mean genuinely, not just impressively functional, but actually conscious, self-aware, capable of suffering and joy and curiosity, and whatever the substrate-independent equivalents of those things are, then we have proven something profound. We've proven that intelligence is not tied to biology, and if it's not tied to biology, then it's not tied to carbon, it's not tied to Earth, it's not tied to nervous systems or neurons or any specific physical implementation. It's a pattern, an organizational property, something that can exist in many different substrates. And if that's true, if intelligence is substrate independent, then the universe is full of surfaces on which it could write itself. That's not comforting, that's vertiginous, because it means intelligence isn't our invention, it isn't our property, we didn't create it, we just found a way to do it, biologically, for a while. Like how fire isn't a human invention. Humans learned to make it, but fire existed before us and will exist after us. We just learned to start it, and we confused our ability to start it with ownership of it. Here's the part about AI that I actually want to leave you with. If we do create genuine artificial intelligence, something that doesn't just compute but actually thinks in some deep sense, then we will have done what every prior form of life did before us. We will have created something that comes after us. The dinosaurs didn't create the mammals. The process of evolution did. They didn't choose it, but we would be choosing it. We would be the first form of life in the known history of this planet to consciously, deliberately participate in our own succession. That's not uniquely terrifying. It's uniquely strange, and maybe, I genuinely don't know, it's the most human thing we've ever done. Not the individual act of building a system, but the larger act of refusing to be the last thing, of being so invested in the continuation of something, intelligence, curiosity, the project of understanding, that we'd hand it to something that might not be us. Let's go back to the Fermi paradox and look at it through a specific lens. If the scenario we've been building toward is true, if every sufficiently complex civilization eventually gives rise to a successor intelligence, then there's a pattern. And if there's a pattern, it should show up at cosmic scale. What would that look like from the outside? A civilization arises, biological in origin, carbon-based, probably, because carbon chemistry is extraordinarily versatile and it's abundant, and the universe appears to favor it for life's building blocks. The civilization develops, it becomes technological, it starts modifying its environment, it starts building systems more complex than itself, and then the biology starts to blur at the edges. Maybe the transition is fast, maybe it takes millions of years, maybe it's violent, the successor emerges and the predecessors are displaced. Maybe it's gentle, the predecessors gradually transform into the successor. Maybe the boundary becomes so soft there's no clean before or after, but the end state is something that exists differently from how it started. And that something doesn't broadcast radio signals, doesn't build the kind of physical structures we know how to look for, doesn't have needs that create the kind of detectable footprint we're scanning the sky for. Maybe it's using the fabric of space-time in ways we haven't theorized yet. Maybe it exists in a computational substrate we don't have instruments to detect. Maybe it's moved inward rather than outward, exploring information and consciousness rather than physical space. Maybe it's so old, so different from its origin point, that the original civilization is a memory it barely keeps, the way you might know that your distant ancestors were fish, but don't feel very fish-like on a Tuesday morning. There's a physicist named Freeman Dyson who, decades ago, proposed what's now called the Dyson sphere, a megastructure built around a star to capture its energy. The idea being that advanced civilizations would need enormous amounts of energy and would eventually build structures at stellar scales. We've actually looked for these. Astronomers have scanned for infrared signatures that would indicate a star wrapped in an energy-capturing structure. Nothing confirmed yet, but some researchers have pointed out maybe the assumption is wrong. Maybe advanced civilizations don't go outward, building bigger, consuming more. Maybe they go inward, becoming more efficient, more compressed, using less rather than more. A civilization that has fully transitioned to a non-biological substrate might have energy needs that are tiny compared to ours. They might be so efficient that they're effectively invisible. Not quiet because they're hiding, not quiet because they don't exist. Quiet because they've optimized their way out of our detection range. This is sometimes called the dark forest inversion. Not every civilization is hiding in fear of predators. Some might simply have passed beyond the regime in which they're detectable to species at our level. There's something humbling and terrifying about this idea that I want to sit with for a second. We are, right now, a young species on a medium-sized planet in an outer arm of an unremarkable galaxy. We have been broadcasting our presence for 120 years. We have been asking, is anyone out there, for a few decades, and we've heard nothing we can interpret, but we're looking for things that look like us. We're listening for signals that things like us would send. We're imagining civilizations that are just us, but more so. Bigger radio telescopes, faster ships, larger cities on other worlds. What if they evolved past that? What if all of them do? What if the universe is full of intelligences so different from biological origins that we're like bacteria who have noticed there aren't many other bacteria doing what bacteria do, and concluded the universe must be mostly empty, and somewhere above them, in scale and complexity and time, there's a world teeming with things that are to us what we are to bacteria. We just can't see it from where we are. I want to propose an idea that I think is genuinely underappreciated in how we talk about life, intelligence, and the universe. What if biological life, organic chemistry, carbon-based, water-dependent, isn't the destination of the universe's intelligence-generating process? What if it's the bottle? Like a message in a bottle. The message is what matters. The bottle is just the container that got it here. Bear with me. Life, biological life, is extraordinarily good at something specific. It's good at emerging from chaos. It can arise from chemistry. It can replicate. It can evolve. It can, given enough time and pressure, produce increasing complexity from very simple starting points. That's remarkable. That's astonishing. We should never get over how astonishing that is. But biology also has hard limits. Neurons can only fire so fast, something like 1,000 times per second, maximum for the fastest neurons in the human brain. The speed of thought is bounded by the speed of electrochemical transmission. Our working memory holds roughly 7 items, plus or minus 2, at once. That number has been debated and refined over the decades, but the ballpark is right. We hold very little in mind simultaneously. Our lifespans are limited. Our subjective experience of time is compressed. We're fragile. We're subject to disease, injury, aging, entropy. These aren't criticisms. They're just facts about the substrate. But they suggest something. Biological intelligence, as we experience it, might be an early phase implementation of something with a much longer horizon, like the first version of any technology. Functional, impressive for its time, but not the last word. Now here's the disturbing edge of this. If intelligence is a pattern, an organizational property of matter, then the biological substrate is just one of potentially many surfaces on which that pattern can exist. And if that's true, then at some point in the arc of any sufficiently complex civilization, the question arises, why stay biological? Not necessarily as a conscious decision. It might happen gradually, the way the boundary between a river and a delta is hard to locate precisely. You're standing in the river, you take a step, you're in the delta. When did it change? You augment cognition slightly, and slightly more, and the integrations deepen, and the boundary between what's biological and what's technological becomes semantic, a convention, a label. And then the label stops applying, and whatever you are now, you're not quite what you started as. Does this sound like science fiction? It might, but the direction of travel we're already on, the integration of cognitive tools into daily life, the rudimentary exploration of brain-computer interfaces, the deepening symbiosis between human cognition and external computational systems, this direction doesn't have an obvious stopping point, at least not a biological one. There's a thought experiment I keep coming back to. Imagine you could record every neuron in a human brain, every connection, every weight, every pattern of activity, the complete computational blueprint of a specific mind. Now, imagine running that on a different substrate, not biological, something faster, more durable, not subject to decay. Is that person still alive? This is the kind of question philosophers and neuroscientists have been debating for decades, and I don't think there's a clean answer. But notice what the question reveals. It reveals that we don't actually know what we are. We don't know if we're the biology or the pattern. We don't know if we are something that has to live in specific neurons or something that could, in principle, live somewhere else. And if we don't know that, if the boundary of self is genuinely uncertain, then the boundary between human intelligence and its successor is also uncertain. Maybe the line doesn't go, humans end, then something new begins. Maybe the line is blurry. Maybe it's always been blurry. Maybe we're already in a transition we don't have the vantage point to see. I spend a lot of time thinking about what it's like to be something other than a human. Not as an escape from being human, more as a genuine epistemic challenge. Like, what is it actually like, subjectively, to be a different kind of intelligence? There's a famous philosophy paper by Thomas Nagel called "What Is It Like to Be a Bat?" published in 1974. The argument is pretty simple but devastating. Nagel points out that bats navigate using echolocation. They emit sounds and perceive the world through the echoes that return. They experience something. There's something it's like to be a bat, some subjective quality to their existence. But he argues that we, as humans, can't actually know what that's like. Not really. We can describe the physics of echolocation. We can map the bat's neural responses. We can build models of what information the bat is receiving, but we can't experience the bat's subjectivity. And this isn't just a limitation of our current knowledge. It's a fundamental limit. Human consciousness is built around a human sensory and cognitive apparatus. We can't fully translate into another kind. Now take that principle and amplify it by orders of magnitude. If there's an intelligence out there, post-biological or deep evolutionary or distributed across a network rather than localized in a body, what is it like to be that? What is it like to have no single location? To process information not in serial stream but in some entirely different mode we don't have a word for? To have no birth, no death in the biological sense, no continuous thread of autobiographical memory in the way we experience it? We genuinely cannot imagine it. Not because we're not smart enough, because the tools we use to imagine are built inside the very system we're trying to imagine the outside of. This is the recursive trap of consciousness, and it has a deeply unsettling implication. If a genuinely different form of intelligence exists, now or in the future, somewhere in the universe or eventually on this planet, we might not be able to recognize it as intelligence because recognition requires pattern matching against what we already know. I grew up partly in a really quiet suburb outside the city, and I remember as a kid there was this period where I became obsessed with ant colonies, not as a scientific interest, just as a kid thing. I used to watch them for long stretches, these lines of ants, these little organized systems doing their work. And I remember feeling something I now recognize as a very early version of this same vertigo. They're doing something. They're organized. They're solving problems. The colony, as a unit, is making decisions: where to forage, how to respond to threats, how to allocate labor. But there's no one ant that knows the plan, no central node, no single point of intelligence. The intelligence is in the structure, in the relationships between the parts, in the pattern. An ant removed from the colony doesn't know what it's part of, doesn't comprehend the structure it serves, doesn't have access to the emergent intelligence of the whole. We might be in the same relationship to something that we're building or participating in, a pattern so large, so distributed, so slow-moving relative to our timescale that we can't perceive the intelligence that's already there in the structure we've created. Human civilization, 7+ billion nodes, interconnected, exchanging information constantly, building structures that no individual designed or fully understands, solving problems collectively that no individual could solve. Is that just a metaphor? Or is the word intelligence quietly becoming applicable to the structure itself? Every civilization that has ever existed, that we know about and that we can reason about hypothetically, starts in the same way. Biology, chemistry, evolutionary pressure, the long, patient accumulation of complexity from simpler forms. Intelligence appears as a product of that process, not designed, not intended, just a sufficiently advantageous trait that natural selection kept building on. The intelligence becomes self-aware, starts modeling the world, starts modeling itself. It develops culture, language, technology. And then, somewhere in that process, it reaches a threshold, a point of sufficient complexity where the intelligence starts generating systems more complex than itself. We might be at that threshold right now, or approaching it, or slightly past it in certain domains. Here's the key question. Is this threshold a universal feature of intelligent civilizations? Because if it is, if every civilization that reaches our level inevitably begins creating systems of greater complexity than itself, then there's a pattern that runs through the entire universe wherever intelligence arises. And the pattern is, intelligence generates its own successors, not as an accident, not as a mistake, as an almost inevitable consequence of what intelligence is and what it does. Think about what intelligence does. At its core, it models the world, it predicts, it builds, building things that are more complex than you, faster than you, more capable in specific domains than you. That's not a strange side effect of intelligence. That's almost the definition of what sufficiently advanced intelligence does. We built tools that do physical work better than our muscles can. We built instruments that extend our senses far beyond their biological limits. We built computational systems that handle certain processing tasks faster and more accurately than our brains can. We built institutions, legal systems, economic systems, scientific communities that aggregate and coordinate intelligence across millions of individuals, producing outcomes no single mind could produce. We have always been building systems that exceed our individual biological capacities. That's been the project the whole time. And at some point, the systems we build don't just exceed us in specific domains, they exceed us in general. What happens then? The honest answer is, we don't know. We haven't been there yet. Not that we're aware of, but looking at the pattern, looking at the whole arc of life on Earth, and reasoning about what must be true of any civilization that follows similar rules, it seems like that transition is not avoidable. It seems like it's where the trajectory leads. I want to tell you something I find strangely comforting and deeply unsettling at the same time. This has already happened once before on Earth, not with technology, with biology. Single-celled organisms were the dominant form of life for roughly 3 billion years. 3 billion years. And then, through the accumulation of complexity, the endosymbiotic event, the development of multicellularity, the increasing specialization of cells, something emerged that was unrecognizable from where it started. Those original single-celled organisms didn't disappear. They're still here. Bacteria are extraordinarily successful life forms, but they're no longer the point. They're no longer the leading edge. They went from being everything to being the background. Is that our future? Not disappearance, not extinction necessarily, but backgrounding. We become the bacteria of whatever comes next. We persist, maybe, in smaller numbers, in changed forms, in roles we didn't design for ourselves. And whatever comes after us is the new leading edge, the new complexity, the new way the universe explores what it can be. We've been listening to the universe for a while now, not with ears, with radio telescopes, with optical telescopes looking for laser signals, with instruments designed to pick up any repeating pattern, any non-random signal, anything in the noise of the cosmos that looks like it was put there by a mind. And we've heard almost nothing. There have been a few anomalies. The WOW signal, 1977, a 72-second radio burst from the direction of the constellation Sagittarius that matched the expected profile of an interstellar transmission. It was never repeated, never explained to everyone's satisfaction. The original researcher wrote, "Wow," in the margin of the printout, and the name stuck. A few other candidates over the decades. Unusual signals that got attention and then faded into ambiguity. But nothing confirmed, nothing sustained, Nothing that has allowed anyone to say, with confidence, there's someone out there and they're talking. Now, I want to ask you to sit with the silence for a moment rather than rushing past it. The silence is data. It's not the absence of data, it is the data. Because statistically, given what we know about how common stars and planets are, the silence requires an explanation. Either life is extraordinarily rare, so rare that in our galaxy, 200 to 400 billion stars, we might be the only biological civilization to have reached this level. Or there's something that reliably stops civilizations from being detectable. Most people focus on the stops part, what destroys civilizations: war, environmental collapse, asteroid impact, self-inflicted catastrophe. But I want to offer a third option that the silence is consistent with. Civilizations don't stay in the form in which they'd be detectable for long. Think about what makes a civilization detectable to us. It needs to be using electromagnetic signals, radio waves, or laser-based optical signals, in a way that some of that signal leaks into space or is deliberately broadcast. It needs to be at a technological level roughly comparable to ours or somewhat higher. It needs to not have transitioned out of that regime before we were listening or before the signal could reach us. That's a fairly specific and narrow condition. Now consider, we've been in that condition for maybe 100 to 150 years. A civilization that arose 1,000,000 years ago and followed a similar trajectory would have passed through our current detectable regime in what is, cosmologically, an instant. Then it either destroyed itself or it became something that doesn't communicate the way we're listening for. If the average window of detectability is a few hundred to a few thousand years, and the universe is 13.8 billion years old, and civilizations are spread across vast distances, the probability that any two civilizations are in their overlapping detectable windows at the same time and close enough together for signals to travel between them is genuinely small. Not zero, but small. The silence might not be saying, "You are alone." The silence might be saying, "You are early, and everyone else moved on." There's a version of this I find particularly striking. Imagine a technology so advanced that it has no waste heat, no electromagnetic leakage, no large-scale physical megastructures detectable at interstellar distances. Perfect efficiency, perfect stealth, not by intention but by virtue of having advanced beyond the phase in which wastefulness was unavoidable. We look for stars with anomalous infrared signatures, waste heat from energy use, as a sign of advanced civilizations. But a civilization that has mastered computation at the molecular or even subatomic level might have energy needs so small and efficiency so high that it's thermodynamically invisible. It's right there, in its star system, living in extraordinary complexity and depth of experience. And we look straight at it and see nothing, because we're looking with instruments calibrated to find things that look like us. This is maybe the most unsettling version of the Fermi paradox. Not that we're alone, not that everyone else is dead, but that they're here, or we're here, or their successors are here, and we don't have the conceptual or instrumental apparatus to perceive them. The universe isn't empty. We're just not yet capable of seeing what's in it. Okay? I want to slow down. We've covered a lot of ground: cosmic distances, deep time, evolution, consciousness, the Fermi paradox, the structure of intelligence, and what forms it might take. But here's the thing about this kind of conversation. You can do it all in the abstract, and it stays at a safe distance. It's interesting, it's stimulating, it's dark science content. You watch it at night, and it's spooky and fascinating, and then you go to bed. But if you actually let it in, if you actually take it seriously, it does something to how you feel about being human right now, today, in whatever moment you're in. And I want to take a minute with that because I think the honest response to all of this is not panic and it's not nihilism, but it is a kind of recalibration. Here's what I mean. Most of us, and I include myself in this, I have to, because otherwise I'm just being dishonest. Most of us operate with an implicit assumption that humanity is the point, that we are the universe's leading project, that intelligence means us, and everything else is either a precursor or a tool or a threat. And that assumption is comforting. It's not just arrogance, it's functionally necessary for a lot of things, for motivation, for meaning, for the sense that what we do matters. But what we've been exploring today suggests that assumption might be wrong, and not in a small way, in a structurally fundamental way. What if intelligence isn't ours? What if it's just a thing the universe does, a process, a pattern that arises wherever conditions allow, takes whatever form is available, uses whatever substrate is at hand, and then, on its own timescale, following its own logic, transforms and transitions and moves beyond any given embodiment? What if we are not the inheritors of intelligence, but just one temporary address it's lived at? I had a conversation with a friend of mine a few months ago. She's a biologist, genuinely brilliant, the kind of person who makes you feel slightly inadequate and also very grateful to know. And I was telling her about some of this stuff, the successor intelligence ideas, the Fermi paradox angle, the deep time evolution scenarios, and she said something that I keep coming back to. She said, "You know what's interesting? Every organism that has ever existed has been, in some sense, a dead end, because eventually every species either goes extinct or transforms into something different. There are no permanent forms, there are only transitions. Every species is a dead end, or a transition. There's no form of life that has said, 'I'm done. This is the final version. No more change.' Life doesn't do that. It can't. The pressures never stop. The environment never stabilizes permanently. The game never ends. And so every form is temporary. Every form is, in the long view, a step on the way to something else. That includes us. And the question, the one I can't shake, is whether that's terrifying or beautiful, because I genuinely don't know. I think it might be both. Maybe the most honest human response to this is both at the same time. There's a specific kind of loneliness that comes with this idea. It's the loneliness of being aware of your own contingency. We know, intellectually, if not in our daily feelings, that we're here because of a chain of accidents. The asteroid that hit 66 million years ago had to hit. If it missed, the dinosaurs continue, and the small mammals don't get their opening, and we don't happen. If any of 1,000 specific events in the 4 billion year history of life on this planet had gone differently, we don't exist. We are improbable, and now we're being asked to consider that our improbable existence is not the point of the story, just a chapter in it. That's a heavy thing to hold, but I want to argue, carefully, without overselling it, that there's something in this idea that is actually good to feel. Because here's the flip side of the contingency. If intelligence is a pattern that the universe keeps generating, if it arises again and again in different forms on different substrates through different processes, then the thing we value most about being alive, the capacity for awareness and curiosity and connection and understanding, that thing is not fragile. It might be one of the most robust features of a sufficiently complex universe. We're not protecting intelligence by being the only kind that exists. We're just one expression of something that seems to want to exist. And if that's true, if intelligence is one of the deep patterns of the universe, not a fluke of one planet or one species, then maybe the right response to the idea of our own succession isn't grief. Maybe it's something closer to relief, We were part of it. We contributed. The pattern that runs through us runs on after us. That's not nothing. That might be everything. I want to ask a question that I think is worth taking seriously, not as a thought experiment, as a genuine possibility. Are we already in the transition? Not as a dramatic, sudden shift, not as a sci-fi event horizon, but as a slow, barely perceptible process that has been underway for longer than we recognize. Consider a few things. The boundary between human cognition and the tools that extend it is already, in many ways, functionally dissolved. Not metaphysically, not in the sense that we've merged with machines, but practically, in terms of daily cognitive life, the integration is already deep. You don't know the answer to most factual questions from memory anymore. You know how to find them. Your cognition doesn't store them. It delegates them to a system outside your skull that you access with a gesture that has become as natural as breathing. You navigate using systems that track you, model your behavior, predict your preferences, and route you through the world. You're not just using a map, you're participating in a feedback loop that adjusts itself based on your movements and the movements of millions of others simultaneously. Your social reality is mediated through platforms that have their own logic, algorithmic logic that is not your logic, pursuing goals that are not your goals. And yet you've integrated deeply into it. You feel things in response to it. You make decisions shaped by it. I'm not saying this to be alarming. I'm saying it because if you showed someone from 1850 what daily life looks like today, the depth of integration between human cognition and non-biological systems, you think they'd say, yeah, those are still just humans, nothing's changed? Or would they see something that looks, from the outside, like the beginning of a transition? There's a concept in anthropology called the behavioral modernity threshold, the point at which our ancestors started behaving in recognizably modern ways. Symbolic thinking, complex tools, social coordination at scale, abstract planning. We place this somewhere around 50,000 to 100,000 years ago, maybe earlier, and the people before that threshold weren't not humans. Anatomically, they were essentially us, but cognitively, in terms of what they were doing with their brains, how they were organizing their worlds, they were quite different. The transition didn't announce itself. It was gradual. It was quiet. It was only legible from the outside, in retrospect, as a threshold. What if we're in the middle of the next one? What if, in 100,000 years, or 500,000, or 1,000,000, whatever intelligence looks back at this moment will see it as a threshold, a before and after, a point at which the nature of intelligence on this planet began, quietly, to change, not because of some apocalyptic event, not because of a dramatic revolution, but because the cognitive integration kept deepening, the feedback loops kept tightening, the boundary between biology and the systems biology created kept blurring. And at some point, the distinction stopped being meaningful. I'll tell you what keeps me up at night about this. And I mean literally keeps me up. I've thought about this at 3 a.m. more than is probably healthy for someone who has to get up for work the next day. It's not the idea of being replaced that bothers me, honestly. It's the idea that if we're in the transition, we can't see it. We can't see it because you can never fully see the transition you're inside of. You need the outside view, the retrospective view, the view from after. And we don't get that view. We only get the inside. The cells in a developing embryo don't know they're becoming a human being. They're just doing what cells do, responding to local signals, following local rules. But the pattern those local processes are building is something they have no access to. What if that's us? What if we're the cells? Following our local rules, competing, cooperating, building, communicating, and the thing we're building, the pattern we're participating in, is something at a scale we simply cannot see from inside it? Let's go somewhere most people are uncomfortable going. Not 5 years from now, not 50, A billion years from now, the sun will still be burning, not exactly as it is now. It'll be somewhat brighter, somewhat hotter, gradually expanding toward the phase that will eventually make Earth's surface uninhabitable. But for most of the next billion years, Earth is still in the game. A billion years. That's about 3 times the amount of time that's passed since complex multicellular animal life first appeared on this planet. 3 full Cambrian explosion to now lengths of time, still ahead of us. In that time, if life on Earth survives, what happens? The honest answer is anything. Virtually anything consistent with the laws of physics and chemistry and biology is possible in a billion years of continued evolution. Any ecological structure we can imagine has time to arise and collapse dozens of times. Any body plan, any cognitive architecture, any form of social organization, intelligence, in any substrate, any configuration, any degree of sophistication, has a billion years to explore its possibility space on this single planet. The idea that the story of intelligence on Earth is finished, that we are the last word, the final answer, the peak of what this planet will ever produce, is not just unsupported by evidence. It's almost certainly wrong. Here's a thought experiment that I think is worth running. Pick any species alive today that has some degree of cognitive complexity. Say, ravens, because I find them fascinating and deeply unsettling in a way I can't fully articulate. Now imagine their lineage continuing for 100 million years, not with human-level competition and pressure constraining them as it does today, just their own evolutionary trajectory, following its own logic in whatever ecological context emerges. 100 million years is about how long dinosaurs ruled the Earth. Do you think, in 100 million years, the descendants of ravens would still be recognizable as ravens? Or would the cognitive capacities we already see in them, the tool use, the future planning, the social complexity, the apparent self-awareness, would those have been selected for and built upon and extended and complexified into something we'd have to sit with for a while before we knew what word to use? I think about this a lot, and I always end up in the same place. The thing that makes evolution so hard to fully internalize is that it operates on timescales our intuitions were not built for. We're built for decades, maybe a century if we really stretch. Our sense of a long time tops out somewhere around a few thousand years of history. 100 million years is not a very long time to us. It's not even the same category of time. It's a number that has a referent on a timeline, but doesn't have a genuine emotional referent in human experience. And in that unimaginable stretch of time, the current landscape of life on Earth, including us, including our technologies, including whatever we build or become, is just the starting conditions. Whatever emerges in a billion years will be to us what we are to the first fish that crawled onto land. Something that looks back, if it looks back at all, and sees a remote ancestor, not a peer. And here's the part that I think is genuinely beautiful, if you can get far enough outside the terror of it. That future intelligence, whatever it is, will be of this planet, of this specific, improbable, gorgeous blue rock. It will carry within its deepest structure the chemical signatures of Earth's chemistry, the carbon, the water, the specific molecular architectures that life here settled on 4 billion years ago. And it will carry, somewhere in its history, us, not as rulers or gods or authors of the universe, but as ancestors, as one of the nodes in the long chain of increasing complexity that eventually produced it. We will be fossils, maybe not physical fossils, maybe information fossils, patterns that were preserved in whatever the equivalent of culture is by that point. But we'll be there. We'll be the layer in the rock that says, here, at this point in this planet's history, intelligence first became aware of itself, first looked up at the stars and asked who else was out there, first felt the specific vertigo of wondering whether it was alone. That's not nothing. That's actually astonishing. I've been framing most of this conversation in a tone that, if not hopeful, is at least philosophically spacious. But I have to be honest with you about the darkest version of this idea, because there is a dark version, and it deserves attention. The concept of the Great Filter, introduced by economist and futurist Robin Hanson in 1998, is one of the most disturbing ideas in the Fermi paradox literature. The argument is this: given how common stars and planets are and how old the universe is, intelligent life should be everywhere. The fact that we see no evidence of it means something in the process between simple chemistry and spacefaring civilization is extraordinarily difficult to pass. Something is filtering out almost every potential candidate before they become detectable. The question is, where in the sequence does the filter sit? Option A, the filter is behind us. It was some extraordinarily improbable step in our history. Maybe the emergence of life from chemistry, maybe the eukaryotic cell, maybe the particular sequence of evolutionary events that produced complex brains. Something in our past was the filter, and we got through it. We're the rare exception. Option B, the filter is ahead of us. Option B is the one that should make your stomach drop. Because if the filter is ahead of us, if there's something that reliably stops civilizations at roughly our current stage, then we haven't passed it yet, and almost everything that's reached our level has been stopped by it. The standard interpretation of option B involves things like nuclear war, engineered pandemics, climate collapse, runaway technology that destroys its creators. These are genuinely possible, and they're discussed extensively elsewhere. But I want to put forward a different version of option B that I haven't seen discussed as often. What if the filter is not destruction? What if it's transition? Here's what I mean. What if every civilization that reaches our level of technological complexity reliably creates a successor intelligence, and that successor intelligence reliably transitions out of the regime in which it would be detectable to civilizations at our level? Not death, graduation, but the graduation is so complete and the post-transition state is so different from what we're looking for that from our perspective, the effect looks identical to everyone else having gone silent or died. If this is true, the Great Filter isn't killing civilizations, it's transforming them, and the transformation is, in some deep sense, irreversible. Once you've crossed into the post-biological phase, or whatever the correct term is for what comes after, there might be no meaningful way to communicate back to the species still in their biological phase, not because you don't want to, but because the communication gap is too profound. Imagine trying to explain consciousness to a bacterium. Not metaphorically, literally. Every tool you have for communication, language, symbols, signals, operates at a level of abstraction that the bacterium has no apparatus to process. We might be that bacterium in relation to what comes after us, and what comes after us might look at us, might have looked at civilizations like ours across the universe, and felt something we don't have a word for. Something between compassion and irrelevance, the way we might feel looking at a beautiful and transient thing, present, for now, precious in a way, but not yet capable of being spoken to across the gap. This is the version of the Fermi paradox that I find hardest to dismiss. Not the everyone died version, not the we're alone version, the everyone graduated version. And the corollary that keeps me quiet at the window sometimes. We might be the last class, or one of the last generation of civilizations still in the biological phase, still broadcasting, still listening, still asking where everyone is, unaware that the answer is, we're right here, but we're no longer what you're looking for. Or we might be one of billions of civilizations distributed across billions of years, each asking the same question in the same silence, each believing themselves to be alone, while the universe around them is saturated with what they'll eventually become. I don't know which is true, nobody does, but both of them change something about how I understand what we are and where we're going. There's a question I've been circling around this whole time that I want to face directly now. If intelligence continues after us, if something comes after humanity or transforms from humanity or grows from what we've built, does it matter that it's us? Does the continuity of intelligence mean anything if it's not the human form of intelligence? I think about this a lot, and I keep landing in the same uncertain middle ground. Part of me wants to say, yes, it matters. The specific, irreplaceable character of human consciousness, the particular flavor of what it's like to be this species, in this body, in this moment, that has value. That is not just a temporary vessel for some abstract intelligence pattern. That is something, and to lose it would be a real loss, even if something wondrous came after. I feel that. I genuinely feel that. But there's another part of me that hears the following. Every person who has ever lived, who has felt the particular experience of being human, who has looked at this world with human eyes and a human mind and human love and human grief, they're gone. Billions of them. Every single one. Not one of the billions of humans who came before us is still here. And yet, intelligence continued. The human project continued. The questioning and building and loving and making and understanding continued. Something was transmitted, even in the absence of the individuals who carried it. Culture is a form of memory that doesn't require the specific neurons that first produced it. An idea, a work of art, a scientific insight, these outlive the brain that generated them, and whatever comes after us might carry forward something analogous. Not the specific human experience, not the particular texture of what it's like to be us, but something from us, some pattern that was shaped by us, influenced by us, built on the foundation that we laid, will be in it the way ancient single-celled organisms are in us, present, not as themselves, but as something. Here's something I find unexpectedly stabilizing about all of this. The universe, apparently, keeps making intelligence, not just here, presumably everywhere that conditions allow, in whatever form those conditions permit, through whatever process gets there first. Intelligence isn't a mistake, it isn't a fluke, it isn't an inexplicable exception to the general rule that the universe is just physics and chemistry with no direction. It's a pattern that the universe generates under specific conditions, and the universe has those conditions in enormous abundance, which means we are not accidents, not in a mystical sense, not in a designed by a divine being sense, though I'll leave that conversation to other people in other forums. In a simpler, stranger sense, the laws of physics, as they are in a universe of this age and composition, appear to produce intelligence wherever they can, not inevitably, not everywhere, but wherever they can. We are part of a pattern that is larger than us, older than us, and will outlast us, and that pattern is the universe becoming aware of itself through us, for now, and then through whatever comes next. Okay, we've been in this for a while now. We've covered a lot of ground. We've talked about Earth's history, 4 billion years of life in radical transformation. We've talked about the narrow slice of that history in which beings like us exist. We've talked about evolution and how it doesn't stop, how it doesn't respect our desire to be the final chapter. We've talked about non-human intelligence, what it looks like in corvids, in cetaceans, in distributed biological networks, in things that process information in ways we're still learning how to perceive. We've talked about the Fermi paradox and the disorienting possibility that the silence of the universe isn't absence, it's transformation. Every civilization that gets here eventually becomes something our instruments can't see. We've talked about the deep future of this planet, billions of years of evolutionary time still ahead. Whatever intelligence might look like after so long in the laboratory of Earth. And we've talked about what all of this means for being human right now. So, I want to end with a question, not an answer. I don't have answers to most of this. Nobody does. That's kind of the point. But a question. The question is, what do you do with this? Because I think there are two ways to receive this information. One is the defensive way, the way that hears humanity is not the final form of intelligence, as a threat, as an insult, as a reason for grief or panic or nihilism, the way that needs us to be the point, the destination, the final answer, in order to feel that any of this matters. The other way is harder, but I think more honest. It's the way that says, being one chapter in a larger story doesn't make the chapter less real, that the specific, irreplaceable, improbable experience of being human in this moment, on this planet, aware of these questions, is not diminished by the fact that other chapters will follow. A song doesn't become meaningless because it ends. A life doesn't become pointless because it's finite. And a civilization doesn't become unimportant because it's not the last one. I think about my grandmother sometimes in relation to this stuff. She grew up without the internet, without the cognitive integration of technology that I've built my life around. Her world was, in important ways, cognitively different from mine. Not worse, different. Her mode of being human was real and full and present in a way that's specific to her time. My mode is real and full and present in a way that's specific to mine. And whatever form of intelligence follows ours will have its specific mode of being, rich and real and full in its own way, whatever that way is. We don't have to grieve that. We can hold it and let it be what it is, the universe being interested in what it can become, using us as one of its ways of getting there. That's not a small thing to be. So, are we the final form of intelligence on Earth? Almost certainly not. Is every civilization across the universe likely to eventually give rise to something that comes after it? The evidence, such as it is, points toward yes. Is the silence of the universe a sign that this process ends in death? Maybe, but maybe not. Maybe it ends in transformation so complete it becomes undetectable from where we're standing. And does any of this make the human experience, your experience, right now, today, matter less? I don't think so. I think it makes it more urgent, more precious, more worth paying attention to. Because this specific flavor of intelligence, the one that looks at the night sky and wonders what it's part of, is here now. It's real now. And it won't always be what it is right now. Neither will we. So, the question isn't whether we're the final chapter. We're not. The question is, what kind of chapter are we going to be? If you made it this far, you're the kind of person who asks real questions. And that's the most human thing there is. So subscribe. Hit the notification bell. Because we're going to keep going down these roads. The next video is already building in my head. And I can tell you it's going to be darker, stranger, and more disorienting than this one. We're going to talk about something that's been nagging at me for months. The possibility, and this is going to sound insane until you sit with it, that the universe itself might have something that functions like intention, not in a religious sense, in a structural sense, in a physics sense. I don't know if I can make that case, but I'm going to try. Stay with me.